So yes, the weekly Huawei. This time we're going to start by talking about them building a great big semiconductor R&D facility in Cambridgeshire.
No, it's not semiconductor.
Isn't it?
No, it's not semiconductor.
Oh crap, I just wrote that in a story. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast recorded on what must surely be the hottest week of the year here in the UK. So if you hear the sounds of kids playing in my neighbour's back garden or my dog barking when someone knocks on the door or anything like that, then I apologise. But the alternative is seeing me melt before your very eyes, which I'm sure nobody wants. So we've got the usual gang here because we're still locked down, although we've got half a mind to record our first face-to-face one on the 10th of July. So we'll confirm that when we know we're allowed in the office, presumably wearing hoods and bells and placards saying unclean. But nonetheless, whatever measures we have to take, hopefully we'll make it in for the 10th. So what we're going to chat about this week, there have been a few stories. So we got less to choose from because we did our last podcast on Monday. But there have been a few stories since then regarding the core network as opposed to the radio access network, which is probably not reported on quite so much, but just as important and a core, excuse the pun, of all the controversy around having Huawei involved in networks, which leads me on to the next subject we're inevitably going to talk about. And I will apologise every time, but we're going to talk about Huawei because once more they've been in the news, especially in the UK, but there have been a few little bits and bobs. And then the last thing we're going to chat about, again, we're going to go for a Scott Bugbear because the guys declined to outvote me on this. And this is to do with a boycott of Facebook and sort of corporate activism and that sort of business. So just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Now, on that note, much of the core stuff has been covered by Jamie and Ian this week, so I'm going to pass the ball to Jamie first. You've been writing a little bit about some stuff going on in Japan and in Germany, so over to you, mate.
Yeah, I mean it's so my approach on this is more is it's not just the core, it's more the sort of the idea of the open ecosystem. So I'm sort of like talking about OpenRAN, but also the fiber side is getting some attention and trying to sort of break the traditional vendor vice grip which is on the industry, as is the core, as you've seen with certain vendors creating sort of containerized cloud native core products. I think the big one there is Rakuten and NEC. But I mean, my takeaway from a lot of what we've seen this week is one of credibility more than anything else. I think few people actually give OpenRAN and the open ecosystem, of which RAN is only a single part of it, I think to a disproportionate amount of attention. Yes, it is a technology set and a segment which is very exciting to encourage innovation and sort of increase market competition. But you've got to remember, this is really, really early days. There's minimal trials going on around the world. And even when there are trials, these are really small scale, and only a fraction are being put into live networks as well. So although there's great progress, you also have to think, well, this is still the early days. But the two deals which you mentioned this week was Mavenir creating a containerized core product with Deutsche Telekom, or at least validating it in the labs, and NEC and NTT doing some sort of work with photonics, which is more fiber products as opposed to wireless products. It's credibility. You got two massive telcos, not a massive tier one in developed aggressive markets who are investing in these new technologies. That provides confidence more than anyone else. I know there's a lot of, some people will talk about the technology and the progress which is being made, and if they put it into live networks, and if they can sell it on because they're creating their own platform to resell to other telcos, I think that's all really exciting. But the tier two and the tier three vendors in the developing markets won't invest in these sorts of products unless there's confidence in them and confidence in the ecosystem. And that's what these deals are doing, especially when you see like NTT buying 5% of NEC as well. It adds credibility. And I think that's one of the most important steps for the open ecosystem. And I know that was a bit of a sort of slightly off topic, but I mean, I don't know whether you took away the same thing from what we were writing, Ian.
Yeah, very much so. And I think one of the other things that's happened this week, which ties in with that theme of credibility, is big announcement by Nokia at the start of the week. Obviously, that is one of the established vendors, but everybody's been talking about what open technologies and open RAN specifically means for these guys. What it means for Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia, the kind of big three of the RAN world. And it's interesting to see Nokia, which has always been a little bit more keen, I think, on OpenRAN as a kind of way to be disruptive. It's the smallest one of the big three. It's interesting to see it come out with its own, product set. Basically, it's the first. I spoke to Gabriel Brown, one of Heavy Reading's analysts on this, and he's been tracking this for a while, and made it out to be quite a significant deal. This is the first big sort of launch of an OpenRAN product portfolio by one of the big three. So it's kind of a sort of validation of the vindication in a way of the technology and the kind of message that the smaller companies have been pushing, and it could give quite a bit of momentum to the market. I mean, it's what Nokia's announced is, it's not a series of partnerships; it's all its own stuff. So already some of the detractors have been saying, well, it's all very well for it to describe these products as Open RAN compliant, but the proof's in the pudding. It really has to sort of show that you can take a bit out, take a bit of Nokia out and put somebody else in, and for it to actually work. But it's it's potentially could give a big push to the market, I think, and it's the kind of thing that some of the operators have been asking for. I remember talking to Deutsche Telekom and their senior vice president of tech, Alex Choi, earlier in the year, and he's been very sort of keen on pushing the big vendors in this area. He's always sort of said we want them to be involved. We want them to kind of participate as well. So I think that's another interesting thing. I think coming on to the specific deals that you've been talking about, Jamie, the Mavenir one's interesting, obviously, because Deutsche Telekom is in the middle of a bit of a shake-up. It's said that it's working towards having a Chinese-free core at the moment. An announcement it came out with a few weeks ago. At the moment, I believe it's heavily reliant on Huawei in that part of the network. So there's increasing scrutiny on Huawei in the core, and seems very likely that a lot of its European business is going to disappear, even if it can kind of hang on to the radio access network business. It's probably going to get squeezed out of a lot of core deals, I think, over the next couple of years. Deutsche Telekom is obviously trying to move away from it, and it's interesting that Mavenir is coming in with some technology that can be used in that area. Could be an example of a smaller player that has a role to play in that market, and it doesn't all just go the way of Cisco or Ericsson or one of the other guys. And then in Japan, the NEC deal is interesting. I mean, we've talked about NEC a few times in the past. Its status has really kind of risen, I think, this year with the Rakuten project in particular. But it's interesting that Rakuten's obviously a big supporter of NEC. You've now got one of the other big Japanese telcos, NTT, coming along and taking a stake in the company, which makes things even more interesting. It's funny to sort of think how that dynamic might work out in the end, because the relationships between these vendors and operators seem to be getting even closer in some cases. You've now got one big vendor in Japan that has sort of very close affiliations with two big competitors in that market. And it's also interesting to see what it could mean for its position overseas. I mean, we're sort of waiting for NEC to kind of do potentially interesting things, I think maybe in the UK, where there's been some government interest, but also in the US market, where Dish is talking about doing a lot of Open RAN stuff, and might also see them as an option.
Yeah, I like Jamie's angle. Sorry, just a brief comment, Jamie, before you come back. I like Jamie's angle on sort of legitimacy. I think massive sort of generational changes tend to happen quite gradually when you're in the middle of it, but then you look back on it and you realize that a sort of new epoch has happened before your very eyes. And that tends to happen just incrementally with a few people showing a little bit more interest, because a lot of it's to do with confidence. No one wants to stick their neck out and go all in on something that's unproven. And so these are little baby steps towards going all in on that stuff. So yeah, I think that angle's very interesting. Sorry, what were you going to say, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add into to my thoughts on the NEC. I mean, yes, it is interesting that NEC is working very heavily with Rakuten, but and then selling a stake in its business to NTT. But I mean, I look at this as, well, two reasons. Firstly, I think NTT wants to hedge its bets. It sees some opportunity to make financial gain out of NEC, which is looking like it's at the forefront of the Open RAN movement. But also, it can, by owning part of NEC, it can guide its product roadmap. It's not just a customer of NEC now; it's a part owner, and I'm presuming that means you get a direct line to the CTO and the chief product officer, and you can start sort of saying, well, you want to develop the product this way, but it will work very well for us if you add these features and these elements into the way you build it. Just remember, we're not only just a customer, we're part owners as well. And I think it's one way to sort of to sort of push their corporate agenda out. I think they've looked at and this is part of the research initiative that they've announced. I can see more and more companies, especially the really forward-looking ones. We've spoken about Rakuten doing this, and Ian, you've mentioned Reliance Jio doing this, entering into this hybrid vendor operator model where they sell containerized services. Because that's the ultimate, test of credibility for tier two and tier three sort of operators for Open RAN. If they're a bit nervous about buying a technology and implementing it from the vendor, buy a product that you can just basically plug and play in your network because it already exists. I think this hybrid operator vendor business model for sort of cloudified, open software defined networks is a really, really interesting development, and I'd like to see. It's interesting that two Japanese companies are taking the charge on it, and be interesting to see if others are brave enough to invest in open RAN and an open fiber product, or that those sorts of areas to build this business model as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering also if one of the things driving this is a concern perhaps that if those smaller vendors, perhaps, I mean, NEC isn't a great example of this, but Rakuten's already sort of taken a majority stake in a company called Altiostar, which is a US firm that provides the software. You see, I think it's Geo has bought Radisys. There are things happening which are really interesting. And I remember bringing up Alex Choi from Deutsche Telekom earlier in the year. I remember asking him if there was concern about, with such a small number of big, powerful vendors in the market these days, and then you've got this emerging technology, Open RAN, that's potentially a threat to these guys and the way they do things. On the one hand, they want to see the big vendors get involved, but they're also concerned to ensure some of the smaller and more innovative firms perhaps don't become takeover targets for those guys, which is something you've seen happen quite a lot in the web world. You see a young sort of innovative company coming along like WhatsApp or Instagram, and before you know it, it's been snapped up by Facebook. So I kind of feel some of this is maybe the operators want to get more involved in that space and become part vendors in a way, as you say, and acquire these companies. sort of secure that innovation really and ensure that it survives outside an Ericsson or a Nokia perhaps.
Yeah, and I hope you're right on that, because there is increasing concern. You look at it among sort of legislators in the States about the sort of overwhelming power of a few companies, leaving aside the Huawei issue, which we're going to discuss in a bit anyway, but looking at like their own web giants, the FANGs, people like Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Google. I think Netflix in the FANGs acronym is a less relevant one. They're not only huge, but they're increasingly cross-platform. So this is a bit of a tangent, but what the hell. So you've got something like Amazon, which has got overwhelming power in retail. Well, it can start to use that in things like financial services or whatever. So can Apple. There was a thing that I wrote about a couple of weeks ago where Apple appeared to be putting pressure on a email app to insist that everyone, and it's a premium email app, so you got to pay a subscription, to force everyone to pay that subscription through Apple, after which it gets a 30% piece of the action, which by itself is a pretty alarming cut. So you put an app on the Apple App Store, and a third of your wedge is gone straight away. So you get all these things, and obviously Google's got its finger in all sorts of little pies, and Facebook, which again I'll talk about a bit at the end. But Facebook started trying to create its own currency, for God's sake. These are examples. So back to what you said, Ian. By far the best resolution to this stuff. Yeah, you do need some regulation. This is a constant confusion where you get people bad faith arguing, where you get sort of relatively laissez-faire free market types such as me arguing for regulation. They're like, oh, you're not so into the free market now, are you? And suddenly implying that you've suddenly gone all statist, but that's just not true at all. Always, ever since Adam Smith wrote about it in The Wealth of Nations, and probably before, it's been known that a functioning free market needs a active regulator, because if people get half the chance, they'll stitch up the general population. Sorry, were you going to say something, Ian?
Yeah, I was just going to, I think a good thing that you maybe don't have in the web world, the telcos are a good counterweight to all this in a way, because, they've been worried for years. I mean, if you go back to before I was covering telecom, probably companies like BT, and some of the, you're on mute, Scott, but yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought I'd unmuted myself, and I muted
comment.
myself. I was making a snarky comment about you not covering telecoms about 100 years ago. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
But the operators themselves, the guys who've been in the industry for a while, they say, a long time ago, we used to be far more active in technology development, and we used to be much more significant compared with the, vendors are obviously doing a lot as well, but they used to have a bigger role in what's going on. And it's, there's a big concern, I think, for years that the vendors have become too, they're the ones that shape the direction of the industry, and they're the ones that take the role in standards bodies, and they're the ones that say what's going to happen and where a technology is going. This is and all this, ORAN and a lot of the other things to do with cloud native technologies, and some of the other things that we talk about quite regularly, I think are driven by that concern that the balance has shifted too much. And combined with that, you've had a wave of consolidation that's brought the number of players, particularly in the mobile infrastructure market, down to a very, very small number today, with about 80%, I think, of the market in the hands of these, three big companies, Ericsson, Huawei and Nokia. So it's I think it's good to see, in a way, operators trying to get a bit more involved in this, and the idea of them going and supporting startups and being a bit, which is kind of related with the kind of, it is a Facebook-backed project, but the telecom infra project, Facebook's obviously got its own reasons for wanting lower cost networks that it can use to get more subscribers in different parts of the world. But there's a big sort of operator side to that story as well, which is that they can get involved and, be in touch with these startups, provide funding to them, become more sort of involved in the technology side of it, the development side of it, rather than just kind of being, dumb pipes is the expression that always gets used, isn't it? But I think that's potentially a good trend for the industry, and it could address some of the concerns, I think, that you see in the market today to do with the geopolitics and the kind of consolidation that exists.
Yeah, well, that's what I was leading up to a minute ago. While you need regulation, the ideal is always for the market to create competition spontaneously. Ideally, you don't want state organisations to step in and optimize the market. It should just sort itself out, and that's what competition's all about. If you've got one dominant player producing a certain commodity and overcharging for it, there's a business opportunity to come in and produce that commodity at a lower price, and that's competition. And that's just one of the other forms of competition. Obviously, just innovation and all that sort of thing. So yes, and then obviously this is made all the more urgent by the topic we're going to get onto in a sec, which is that Huawei is increasingly not an option if you want to stay in the good books of the Yanks. So that just leaves two, and nobody likes a duopoly. That's only one more than a monopoly. So there's even more urgency. So it's good to see the market actually behaving in a healthy, functional way and striving to increase the amount of competition. Cool. All right, then. If no one else has got anything to pitch in on that, seeing as I've sort of intimated it, I'll move on to the Huawei thing, which is our weekly thing. I think if there's ever a week where there isn't something to say about Huawei, we just won't record a pod. Ian's got family members wandering around in the background. No one saw that. That's funny. So yes, the weekly Huawei. This time we're going to start by talking about them building a great big semiconductor R&D facility in Cambridgeshire.
No, it's not semiconductor.
Isn't it?
No, it's not semiconductor.
Oh crap! I just wrote that in a story.
No, that's the big thing that they said in the story yesterday, or the press conference yesterday. It's Optoelectronics, which is obviously creating products which have semiconductors in them, but it's not a semiconductor R&D site.
That's a very good point, and I knew that, and it for some reason slipped my mind when I wrote my story. So as soon as I finished recording this,
I think it got misrepresented in some of the mainstream press.
Yeah, well,
the chip factory.
If anyone read that and they're about to put an abusive comment in the story, I will put an amendment. Anyway, so this shows that I don't know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to shut up and ask Jamie to tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, it's seems to be. I mean, I'll give my top end view on it. Well, I mean, the story is they back in 2017 they bought a load of land in Cambridgeshire, something like God knows how many acres, to develop an R&D centre, and that has been given approval so they can start the construction of it this week. So they're going to be spending £1 billion apparently, and it's going to create 400 jobs in this optoelectronics area, which is sort of creating products for basically fixed networks is the way I described it. So it's not necessarily just broadband, but it's also sort of data center interconnect, and sort of like backhaul as well. I mean, I'm right in categorizing like that, aren't I?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, optoelectronics, mainly fiber optic networks. Yeah, I mean, those are the main details. I think it's a £1 billion investment, isn't it? I think, which is more than figures that were sort of touted around previously, I think. But as you say, it's been in the works for a while. There has been some press, sort of mainstream press articles which they wanted to address on the call that Jamie and I were on yesterday, suggesting that this was time to sort of make government decisions about their role even harder, and that it was a way to get around the latest US restrictions and all of this. And Victor Zhang, who's sort of their main UK person at the moment, was very quick to sort of point out that, details that Jamie just mentioned, they actually started the ball rolling for all of this back in 2017. And they couldn't possibly know that Cambridge District County Council was going to come out this week and sort of give approval. But the timing's interesting. I mean, it does make things a bit harder, I guess, for the government. There's obviously, I think already even you guys have reported on this, the US making a fuss and saying, how can you do something like this given, what a security threat Huawei poses? And there's going to be more pressure, no doubt, on Boris Johnson from some of the sort of backbench MPs who are always critical about this kind of stuff. What's his name? Tom Tugendhat, is it? I can never pronounce it.
Yeah, I can never pronounce it.
Yeah, he's usually the main sort of person grumbling. He's equivalent of the sort of hardcore sort of senators in the US, isn't he, really, over here?
And he was the one, so that was the piece I wrote where, while we're on the pod, I actually edited my piece. You'll be amazed to hear at my multitasking. I actually used the I actually used the technique of using the strike through. So I left semiconductors in, which I wrote, put a strike through, and put Optoelectronics. So how about that? Who says blokes can't multitask? And yes, the reason I wrote that is because the FT, some unnamed US State Department person went and moaned to the FT about it and made all these sort of veiled threats. They didn't say anything direct, but they just sort of said the usual stuff about how it's going to make shit more complicated when you start doing stuff like this. And then old Tug and Hat piped up because some, again, unnamed US political source came and lent on him and basically said that they are worried about where was the quote? They are concerned. This is the quote. They are concerned about the possibility that US chips will be tested by Huawei in the UK. So that's the sort of semiconductor angle. But you guys are obviously right to correct me and say that this is optoelectronics, not necessarily just straight up chips. But the reason I think. Go on,
Sorry, Scott. I was just going to say it's also worth noting that it's not completely new what Huawei's doing here. They do actually have a facility in Ipswich at Industrial Park. I think it's where sort of BT is.
Yeah, a bit of BT action.
That does this sort of stuff. It's in this area. This is kind of like it's a new facility. Obviously, potentially raises questions about what happens to the Industrial Park one in the future. But it's bigger. It's a bigger sort of planned investment, more people and. There's a big sum attached to it, and it's also going to be, the idea is for this to be the international headquarters of the optoelectronics side of the business. So that's everything outside China, which has its own sort of HQ for this. But it's not as though they're doing something that they haven't had some involvement in before in the UK. I mean, optoelectronics is probably the thing that dates back the longest with Huawei in the UK. They first came in about 2005, I think, doing this sort of stuff with BT. So.
And it's interesting. I mean, there hasn't been, the thing that annoys me about the Yanks putting pressure on isn't that they don't have legitimate concerns. That's fine. God knows we've been over the can you trust any Chinese company not to be able to resist the influence of the Communist Party if that comes. It's just it just sort of keeps shifting the goalposts. So it was 5G. And initially it's 5G because that's going to become this sort of Skynet, everything connected, hive mind type of thing. And then they start getting onto semiconductors, and no one, Huawei can't have any of our semiconductors because they might steal our IP or plant some little bug in it or whatever. And now, but I've never heard them really speak about about anything fixed line. But in principle, the paranoia about a sort of pernicious Chinese influence on telecoms networks should apply absolutely everywhere, shouldn't it?
Well, I think this is the strange thing, though, isn't it? We never really got to the bottom of this whole debate about what's which are the secure areas and which aren't the secure areas, and certainly the operators believe they can mitigate risk by keeping Huawei out of the core. And if it's as long as it's not in the core, then they don't see there's a problem with having it in either the radio access network or the transmission side, which includes a lot of this stuff we're talking about now.
But what about backhaul, for example?
Well, backhauls. I mean, it's a similar thing, isn't it? That's the sort of transport side of it, really. So it's usually fibre links these days, I think.
Yeah. But my point is, if they're not going on about optical, are they not missing a trick on backhaul? They could get us to keep it out of the RAN, keep it out of the core, but there'd still be Huawei in the backhaul potentially.
Yeah, well, maybe this is just the US officials missing a big part of the picture. I don't know, but there's two arguments on the, if you're just looking at the radio and the core and ignoring the transmission side and, where that stands, I don't know what the critics would say about that. But one argument is that, which is the one that operators have been promoting and that Huawei is obviously promoting, you keep, the core is the most sensitive area. If it's in the radio access network, it's not a problem. There's the other side, which is the US one, that, even the radio now is risky and will become more so with this transition to 5G networks because we're moving intelligence out closer to the edge and you can put core functions, nearer to base stations and the perimeter starts to blur. And that's also something, interestingly, Ericsson has kind of come out with that argument as well. When I've had discussions with them, one of their fairly senior executives, Arun Bansal, I think was quoted in the press today in an interview with Sky, but he's someone who's sort of come out with this argument that the lines are blurring with the move to 5G. They're often quite keen to be seen staying out of the whole geopolitical side of it because they don't want to cause offence. But they sort of sneakily make these comments that are obviously designed to put a bit of pressure on, I think. And I think today he was saying, what was he saying to Sky? That they can quite happily come in and cope with all this demand if Huawei is. We don't want to get involved, but if Huawei is made to kind of exit, we can come in and deal with everything.
Just so you know, we're ready.
Yeah, just in case. We're ready and we can do it all.
If you're concerned, don't worry. We can actually come in and do it all. Is effectively what he said, really, wasn't it? And it's, I don't know. I mean, this entire thing, it's becoming less and less about technology every single week. There's one common thread throughout everything, and that is effectively that the US aggression is always directed towards China. If the US was going to be a bit more intelligent and strategic about this, they should have probably directed as much attention towards suppliers that are coming out of Russia as well, because no US politician trusts the Russians. So why is it that all this sort of technology debate is directed towards China, not against adversaries of the US? The other argument there might be that Russia isn't that great on cutting edge telco and IT, but ultimately, it depends which way you read it. Ultimately, it is quite clear that this is every week that this is becoming less and less about technology and more about geopolitics, which is disappointing because every CTO on the planet, I'm sure, would want to make decisions based on the value of technology and the commercial value of technology to that organization, as opposed to geopolitical decisions. Like, for instance, BT. I'm sure if Huawei has the best core product or the one that is best configured with their network, they'd like to go with a Huawei core. But that has been taken out of their hands. These are ultimately technologists who want to create the best possible product. And that has been effectively taken out of their hands for political reasons, not technology ones.
And you've got your thing you wrote this morning, Jamie, about US sort of compiling a sort of checklist of other Chinese companies to move against. Do you want to quickly mention that?
Yeah, I don't believe that that's the first time they've ever made this list. I just think it's the first time that it's seen the light of day. They created a list of 20 companies that have links to the Chinese government or the military that operate on US soil, and therefore US organizations and authorities should be aware of them. But the Department of Defense was mandated to do this through the legislation. I think it was like the National Security Act or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, but that was passed through Congress in 1999. And I struggle to believe that the Department of Defense, having been ordered to do something in 1999, has gotten around to doing it 21 years later. So my assumption is that this is the first time that it's been leaked or declassified. So yes, okay, Huawei's on that list, but I would assume / guess that Huawei's probably been on that list for 3 or 4 years. It's just this is the first time we're knowing about it. And all I think this is just a bureaucratic step. Every democracy has checks and balances built into government's procedures and protocol to ensure that there's no abuse. So I imagine that this is one step of up the bureaucratic ladder to increased political and administrative pressure on China and Chinese companies. It also grants more powers for executive orders. There's a lot of things that this list does. It demonizes Huawei in the eyes of the American public as well. So I think it's something that's not new, but something which is an incremental step towards more political aggression and mudslinging going across the Pacific.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier about big change tends to happen incrementally, and that's one of the fun things about this job is that it's our day job to catalogue each increment as it happens and comment on it. There was just one other little detail to do with Huawei in that context is I wrote a story about Singapore. Their two main, well, basically they're three MNOs because two of them are jointly building their 5G network. Have both announced. Singtel announced Ericsson and StarHub/M1 announced Nokia as their pretty much exclusive 5G kit vendor partners. So that's just another sort of minor setback for Huawei and the Chinese American dynamic, given that Singapore is obviously right there in Southeast Asia. So that must feel like a little bit of a blow. One other just slight tangent I want to make about Huawei. I'm just reminded looking through stuff we've written. This isn't to do with necessarily directly with what we were talking about before, but we've spoken about this on the pod before, using 5G patents as some kind of measure of how advanced or how good or whatever a vendor is. And I had a company get in touch with me called Grey Bee, which is a research company, and they've basically gone to look into the patents. So, one thing to stress about patents is that whole world is incredibly arcane and murky. And there's a big difference between filing a patent and getting it granted. And there's a big difference between any old patent and a standard essential patent. And they even go so far as to try and identify core standard essential patents, i.e., patents that are definitely central to the 5G standard. And their research concluded that of all of them, Huawei owns the most at 19%, followed by Samsung at 15%, LG 14%, Nokia 12%, Qualcomm 12%, and Ericsson just 9%. So, there's an interesting thing, I suppose, in the context of what we were talking about before. If Huawei really is a standard essential patent leader in 5G, how much can the Americans freeze them out? Which probably explains their decision they made a couple of weeks ago of going, all right, you can chat to Huawei if it's about the 5G standard. Because someone probably went up to them and went, look, mate, they got a fifth of the standard. We can't just ignore them. So that's just one other feature there.
They can build things with them, but not use. They can build things with other. I mean, this is the irony of this, that you have technology in the US now that is built by Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung, but it's based on a standard that is part developed by the Chinese, So it has Chinese IP in it. You can get rid of Huawei equipment, but you can't get rid of the actual intellectual property underneath it unless you go down a route of breaking apart the global standard and saying, and that would almost be like starting from scratch again, because all these things are built on top of other things, So that's the irony of the situation, really, is that they can't freeze out Chinese tech completely, even though they can build things without Chinese equipment. There's always going to be the actual expertise is going to be part Chinese, whatever Huawei's role is. And that Grey Bee study, I think, is no more conclusive than various others that have been done. I mean, that was sort of slightly taken apart by a guy called Richard Windsor, who's used to work for Nomura Securities years ago, but has his own sort of analyst firm these days. But there's no disputing they're a significant player in 5G and that they're important. And that's the sort of daft thing about all of this, really, is that you can't completely remove Chinese expertise from what is a global standard. The only way to completely cut them out is to start again and build a standard that doesn't have any of that in it. And maybe that's where we end up going in the future with 6G and other things. I don't know how feasible it will be to do that, but it's at the moment, there's just so much. It's almost like the officials don't recognise this. I think this is to do with misunderstanding by the politicians, actually. They don't
I think so. And back to Jamie's point about it being increasingly more about politics than about technology. And I think the Americans are really overreaching, because every time anyone does anything, like, the permission, I mean, I don't know how much central government was involved, but according to the reporting I've seen, the permission for this Optoelectronics Centre in Cambridgeshire was granted by the local council. And they're presumably the ones that have jurisdiction over things like planning permission. So I don't know whether they had to refer it up to Bojo, who just went, oh, go on then. But
I would have thought it was something maybe that it's hard to think that it would have.
You'd think the government would have some say in it. It wouldn't have just sort of crept up on it.
But interfering in things like, I mean, it's a hard decision, isn't it, for the government, because we're coming out of possibly not even coming out. Let's hope we are coming out, but coming out of this pandemic. Let's be optimistic. And the economy is not in a very good position at the moment. We need investment. We need big companies to come along and create jobs. And it's not just about the 400 jobs, which is a relatively small number in the bigger scheme of things. It's about what that leads to. Jamie was asking questions on the call about startups they're planning to work with. They're going to be in Silicon Fen, which is a big area with numerous other tech companies. It could lead to other things. If you take the geopolitics out of it, that's the kind of thing a government wants to hear at a time like this. So,
yeah, just slight correction. Certainly, my understanding, and you guys were on the call. Tell me if you think I got this wrong. But the precise location is quite a bit south of Cambridge. It's not in. That's not Silicon Fen.
Well, it's near Silicon Fen, isn't it? It's
a 15-minute drive.
You're down the road from it. You hop on your bike and
but that's the same as saying that Apple's headquarters isn't Silicon Valley. I mean, it's like 40 miles away or something like that, isn't it? The big one.
I mean, San Francisco is not Silicon Valley, strictly speaking.
Okay, but I mean, Silicon Fen itself is a sort of extended campus. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the part of the world where they're in the part of the UK which is regarded as a high tech centre, basically, and they can tap into all sorts of expertise there. They're near one of the best universities in the world, and it's $1 billion investment. It's significant, so it's a big, it's a potential big boost for the local economy.
Yeah, totally.
Why the councils like, yes, please, we'll have more of this. They'll think about things in those terms when they've got joblessness and all these other things to face in the next couple of years. So it's an awkward decision for the government to face, to have to
say. And I think
do it, because
I think the Americans are overreaching, because every time someone does something like this, and for the reasons we've just discussed, there are many things in favor of it. For the Americans to have a strop, I think each time they expend some political and diplomatic capital. And what they seem to be basically saying is the whole world, if they want to be friends with us, better do exactly what we want on this subject the whole time, which I just don't think is a sustainable position for them. And every time they get the arsehole over something like this happening, I think they lose a bit of goodwill with their allies. So I think they've got to be careful not to end up isolating themselves. This is how diplomacy works. I know they're the biggest and the most powerful and the richest and all that sort of thing. But, if they didn't need allies, we wouldn't be having these conversations, would we? So, yeah. Okay. Cool. What else was I going to say? All right, we might as well move on to the final thing. You're going to say something, Jamie?
I did want to add was that, so from my understanding, from talking to the Huawei guys, they obviously haven't actually come out with any official statement or anything along those lines just yet. But the startup element is a big thing for them, and that is why the Cambridgeshire area and that sort of that land was chosen. There are plans to have an open lab. There are plans, or it has been unofficially discussed. And there are plans to create an incubation fund and centre and initiative to bring startups in. You put something next to. Why would you put anything next to Cambridge University? It's because you've got spin-offs coming out of there. Ultimately, when you go to Cambridge, Oxford isn't a million miles away as well. You've got some really big technology companies there and a lot of PhD graduates coming out of these universities who can actually develop companies to build into this ecosystem. The other thing that is worth noting as well is that a couple of years ago, Huawei and BT created a lab inside Cambridge University and a research and innovation fund to push, these sorts of technologies up the sort of the PhD agenda. So there is history of, and they spent 25 million on this, so it's not chump change. So there is history of Huawei targeting this area for the expertise in a similar way that, I don't know, Ericsson might build an R&D center on the outskirts of in Mountain View, let's say. There is logic behind it, and they are trying to develop and create an ecosystem in this area. So I think it's a good move. Yeah, it's great. I think unless the UK, I agree with you, Bojo would have got some sort of phone call, and he probably would have vetoed it if he felt that passionately about it. But I think that ultimately, the UK has turned around and says we're not gonna compromise our technological and economic prosperity at the whim of someone, a moody orange fella in the White House who might not even be there come November.
Good point.
That's
Maybe that's the bet. Maybe they're just hoping that let's just keep this debate going for a few months and let's see what happens later in the year.
I'm sure a lot of global stuff ends up revolving around the US electoral cycle, especially when you have as willful and unpredictable a person in the White House as they currently do. I mean, the other thing, talking about politics, that always occurs to me when I'm chatting about this to people. So I voted leave in the Brexit campaign, and the reason I wanted to leave is so that the UK could make its own decisions and not be constrained by the European Union. So I do find it a bit ironic that a lot of the people who voted leave are now, and I reckon this Tug and Hat is one of them, are now going, well, we should definitely do what the Yanks want because we don't want to upset them. I was like, well, no. We want to be independent, and if that means that we're isolated to a certain degree, so be it. But let's forge our own path. Obviously, you have to make diplomatic considerations, but ultimately, we're the fifth largest economy in the world. Why can't we make our own mind up? Anyway, end of political rant on that one. So it'll be interesting to see if this plays out and see if anyone sort of intervenes. And gets involved. And let's not forget, actually, the point Jamie was just making about foreign direct investment in general. We applaud the fact that, Nissan invests in Sunderland to make cars or something like that. In principle, this is the same. Obviously, there's all the undertone to do with China and whatever its geopolitical ambitions are. And the whole Belt and Road Initiative is not lost on me. And it wouldn't be surprising. This is certainly some of the pushback they're getting in places like India for China to strategically, with the world kind of belittled and compromised by the coronavirus pandemic, for China to pick some select opportunities to invest in inverted commas heavily in certain countries and then have a greater influence over them. And that's certainly something to keep an eye on. But foreign direct investment is something we've always had from places all over the world. And in principle, there's no reason why Huawei shouldn't have a fair crack of the whip along with Nissan or whoever.
It must be. I mean, just like Jamie's point about Bojo probably getting a phone call and not vetoing it is quite interesting, really, because it must have send a little bit of confidence out, I guess, to Huawei that decision that was made in January about restricting them but not banning them is going to be the one that holds, and that what's going to happen? I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but it would be a strange thing to allow this to go ahead and then all of a sudden decide to do what the Americans want you to do, which is not have a Huawei anywhere, really. I mean, it's not just 5G they want it excluding from, is it? They really just don't want to see it anywhere in the country at all, from a sort of hardline perspective. So, it'd be strange for this to happen and then something like that to emerge down the road. So they must feel a little bit more optimistic, I guess, this week about their situation. But who knows what's going to happen? I mean, it just keeps going backwards and forwards.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it gives us one for them to do anything on. That's the problem. There's no easy way around this now.
No.
With all the pressure from the US, and we're going to start pulling fighter jets out of your country, and we're not going to do trade with you unless you do exactly what we want to do.
And we're not going to do the Five Eyes alliance. It's too much.
And then on the other hand, you're going to upset the Chinese, but more significantly, the point that gets made about the overhaul of our existing networks that are heavily reliant on Huawei equipment is that's not something that can be done quickly or easily or cheaply, and could be a big setback for 5G in this country, among other things. There's the fiber to consider as well. If these things are economically critical these days, then that's the last thing we need coming out of coronavirus, to have any kind of delay happening.
Yeah, everything's so interconnected. But, thank God it doesn't get resolved, Ian. Otherwise, what would we bang on about every week? So there is that. Okay, talking about banging on, we banged on about this topic for quite a while, so I'm going to move it on to my little pet topic, which I just think is an interesting thing. At the start of the week, some brands started boycotting Facebook advertising, and they did it apparently at the urging of a group of sort of political activists, such as the ACLU, NAACP, and about 4 others, who all got together to lobby for Facebook to be boycotted by companies. And the reason they did it is all this sort of usual nebulous stuff about hate speech and horridness and intolerance and all that sort of thing. But I couldn't see why just Facebook had been singled out. Why it wasn't also Twitter and YouTube and any other internet platform. And my conclusion was that Facebook is the one that's most pushed back on the censorship of political stuff. So Twitter has started labeling Trump stuff as disinformation and even outright censoring some of it, at least with a sort of label over it that you have to click on before you get to see what he's said. They're not doing it to any of his political opponents, so that leaves them open to the charge of selective censorship. And Facebook is doing less of this. And so that happened at the start of the week, and then a few joined in, but it was kind of the usual suspects, people like Ben and Jerry's, for God's sake, which has never spotted a sort of right-on cause that it doesn't want to ally its premium ice cream brand to. So it's not enough just for us to sit there sort of getting diabetes while we eat their ice cream. We've got to feel that we're helping save the world as well. And that was one thing. But then over the course of the week, they put on more pressure and sent out an open letter pointing out that certain ads had been served against questionable content that was on Facebook. So, everyone who does Facebook knows that you can get some crazy stuff there. That's the whole point of social media. Anyone can whack anything up. And sometimes the ad algorithm, it's not like they cherry pick and they go, okay, we'll get the Verizon ad, we'll put it there. There's an algorithm that just spams it out all over the place. And sometimes it gets served against some moody content. And they managed to find an example of that. And for Verizon, so this is where my dubious telecoms justification for banging on about this stuff kicks in. And so Verizon saw this and shat themselves and thought, oh God, now our brand's being associated with hate or whatever the word we use to describe stuff that people disapprove of. And so they've decided to boycott advertising on Facebook. And then the ACLU, which seems to be the most prominent of these political campaigners, then went on Twitter and went, yay, we've got Verizon to join us. It's gathering speed, it's snowballing and all that sort of thing. But I wrote a piece today saying it's not what it seems, because Verizon's basically just concerned about this ad positioning. It's not making a moral or ethical statement about Facebook and censorship. It's just saying, don't put our ads next to moody stuff. So all Facebook's got to do is go off. And YouTube did this a few years ago when both Verizon and AT&T boycotted advertising on YouTube. They just changed the algorithm such that their ads only went up against stuff that was super safe. And that's all that they're going to do for Facebook.
Is that what they're asking
resolve the
for?
problem. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, Scott. Is that what they've actually asked for, though, Verizon? Is it fairly clear from their side that they've sort of come ahead and said and sort of drawn a parallel and said, look, we just need a more sophisticated...
No, they've been quite vague. They haven't made, at time of podding, they hadn't made a formal public statement themselves. There's just a CNBC story where they just talk about, let me see if I can... Oh, yeah, here's a quote they got from Verizon's chief media officer, John Nitti. He said, we have strict content policies in place and have zero tolerance when they are breached. We take action, which is not very grammatical there, Nitti. Sort that out. We're pausing our advertising until Facebook can create an acceptable solution that makes us comfortable and is consistent with what we've done with YouTube and other partners. That's the only public statement I've seen from them. And that mention of YouTube is what leads me to believe that that's the provenance of it. But no, in answer to your question, it's not explicit that that's what they want. There's definitely some conjecture on my part there, but it seems the only reasonable conclusion to come to on the evidence available. So, yeah, so just to sort of conclude, that the interesting point to me, before I throw it out to you guys, see if you got any thoughts on it, is that we're increasingly seeing the public square, and the electronic public square is basically dictated by social media companies. And we chatted about this a week or two ago about to what extent they should be forced to let content go on them, and that's a good conversation to have. But the public square is able to be dominated by activist groups via putting pressure on corporates who are increasingly cowed and frightened about being at the center of a social media storm. So they will jump on these sort of boycotts just because they're worried about being on the wrong kind of hashtag. And I think that's a sort of alarming development.
As you say, that it's like it's almost tangential, isn't it? The Verizon position, because it's like not endorsing a particular athlete because he's, said something dubious, but maybe not even that. Maybe he's just not a particularly appealing character for them, for their particular brand, and they don't want anything next to him. It kind of takes it into that area. They've been appropriated by these groups that want to make political statements, but their actual concern is much more prosaic in a way. And if they can get that dealt with, then it'd be a worrying trend, wouldn't it? If there's a lot of big companies that are suddenly deciding that they're pulling advertising, not because they want adverts, because they're worried about where adverts are placed, but simply because they're taking quite a firm position on this whole issue of censorship and what companies say, and companies being perceived to do the right thing. I think that is set a very worrying precedent if that starts to happen, really.
Yeah, because it's so subjective. Who's to say what the right thing is? And there seems to be a sort of consensus that certain things are okay and certain things aren't. But there's no due process. There's no democratic process in deciding what's acceptable and what isn't. It just seems to be decided by the mob. And another point to bring up, ACLU. So you get these activist organisations involved in it, and they're sort of considered beyond reproach. Not ACLU. If I've said that throughout, let me take that back. It's the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. ACLU is another sort of campaigning group, so I retract that. It's ADL I meant to say all along. And they were originally founded way back at the start of the 20th century to campaign against prejudicial publicity against Jewish people, specifically fighting anti-Semitism. But I looked up this page for an organisation called Influence Watch. And it seems quite clear that more recently they've become very much a political campaigning organisation on the Democrat side. So it seems quite open that they are hostile to Republicans and hostile to Donald Trump. And that's fine. They're entitled to be hostile to Donald Trump and they're entitled to campaign against him, but let's have transparency about it. And when they try and make out that this campaign is all about hate speech and making the world a better place, when really there seems to be a decent amount of evidence that it's heavily politically biased, then I think people should know that. And I look at the reporting on this. For example, this particular thing to do with Verizon, as far as I can see, my story is the only one that called into question the reason for Verizon's actions. Everyone else just lazily went, "Oh, they've joined the campaign," and that's really not what's happening at all. Cool. All right. I will take that pause to mean that no one's got anything further to add, and I think we've done about an hour anyway. So I'm off to go and fan my face and try and cool down. It's pathetic, isn't it? Next week we'll be recording the pod and I'll be moaning about how cold it is. But that's part of the British condition, isn't it? Thanks a lot once more, guys, and thank you for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.